Hello and welcome to another episode of 28.4 FM, a podcast where we connect India's youth to the world through conversation and discourse. Today, I'm joined by my co-host from New Delhi, Rishika. Rishika, we really missed you on the last episode with the chief economic advisor, but I'm glad you could make this one because it's special.
Yeah, I missed you guys too. And this episode, yeah, it's definitely special because we're interviewing our youngest guest so far, but also we're interviewing someone who's championing a cause that doesn't just like matter to us. It matters to, I mean, the planet, right? It's no one's free from the consequences of this cause, and I'm so excited to have you on, Maithili. Today we are going to be talking about water conservation and how you are personally working towards it through a model of entrepreneurship. So yeah.
Today's episode is a story of entrepreneurship, which at its core is the ability to solve a problem in society. But it's also a story of social change, which in a country as large and diverse as India has to begin ground up. A 2019 report released by the World Resources Institute flags India as one of the 18 countries with the highest level of water stress. Now, as you can imagine, that has huge ramifications for a country that is so dependent on agriculture, which is a big consumer of water. Now, the estimate pegs that 70% of our sort of groundwater use is used for agricultural purposes alone. So, we thought we'd highlight the work done by our guest today, who has launched a social venture aimed at helping farmers to conserve more rainwater while improving their livelihoods and incomes. Maithili, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today.
So wait, this is when Abhishek told me that we could like do this episode. I told him that I have to be on this. Like this is something we have to talk about. So before we get into your work and the social issue at hand, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, like your background, where you studied, what you're currently doing, how Avana came about, just sort of brief introduction to you.
Sure. So I am Maithili Appalwar, like you introduced me already, but I'm born and brought up in Mumbai. Abhishek and I actually go way back because we were in school together at Dhirubhai Ambani and did Model UN together. So fun time. Anyway, so after that, I went to Georgia Tech and I studied industrial engineering. But not really wasn't really super interested in industrial engineering as much, but I got very interested in kind of the confluence of technology and social impact, and I was lucky that I was able to take a lot of social impact and social enterprise related classes about how you can start a company that's both making money as well as solving a social cause. So that, like, in some senses, I felt like that was very foundational to me starting a company in the social sector. And then when I came back to India, so I think a lot of people ask me how I got passionate about agricultural water conservation, because it is sort of random, for somebody who grew up completely in Mumbai. Like, it doesn't strike you as like the first social cause that you will be passionate about. And it was definitely totally by chance. Like, I didn't wake up one morning and was like, oh, like, we're in a water crisis, we need to do something about it. Like, I, I frankly like was definitely one of those people that completely ignored that India, and for that matter, like globally, we are extremely water stressed and we're in a water crisis. But I was really, really passionate about mental health. And my senior thesis project at Georgia Tech was about coming up with curriculums and techniques to solve mental health crises in low resource communities. So I was looking at both rural communities as well as the urban poor. And so I went to Yavatmal, which is a district where my family is from. Long back family is from, but they're
And this
still
is in
like,
Maharashtra, just for people who need to know
yeah.
that.
So Yavatmal is a district, yes, in north northwestern. Sorry, my direction sense is like, yeah, it is. Bombay is on the northeastern part of Maharashtra. Sorry. Anyway, so I started kind of working there for, like, solving the mental health crisis, and my solutions were just stupid at best, because I was like, oh, you should sleep for 8 hours a day, and then you should have like a counselor to talk to, eat healthy food, exercise. And I was talking to a population that, like, you know did a lot of these things, and some of these things, they were very far away from their reality. Like, talk therapy was not necessarily the first thing that came to mind. Not that it's not useful, I go to a therapist every week, but that was not the first thing that came to mind, and that was definitely not the root cause kind of their problems. Was definitely not rooted in clinical mental health issues. So that was something very interesting that I found out in research later on, was that even though India's rural suicide rate is actually one of the highest in the world, um, a lot of it is not rooted in clinical depression due to biological causes, which was very, very interesting to me, because we definitely think of it as something that with psychological therapy or with medicines it can be solved. But here we were looking at a population that had such severe poverty and was locked in such a crazy poverty cycle that just giving them talk therapy, even if it were free, or giving them medicines, was not going to solve their problems. So we started kind of working on and doing, root cause analysis as to where a lot of these problems were coming from, and what I realized, and I guess what the community realized. Like, it was definitely not a personal solution. It was a very community driven solution. But what a lot of people were talking about was that, we don't have a clear source of irrigation. Like, the bigger irrigation projects that are there in areas, like a lot of areas have canals or they have dams, but few people know this, in urban India. But for example, with canals, when the canal water, when the government lets out the water, they don't let it out in spurts in a lot of places. They let out like a ton of water at once. So if you don't have a capturing device for canal water, it's
It's
basically
basically
completely useless.
useless. Yeah.
Yeah, it's useless to you. So there were like a lot of these small caveats, and what I was realizing, that water was kind of a big reason why these people were not able to take 3 cropping seasons. Like, a lot of people were only taking 1 or at max 2 cropping seasons, or they were not able to take like high paying crops like horticulture crops or cash crops. And so it seemed to me that, like, if we were able to come up with a way to devise like a affordable and high quality water conservation solution, then that could be something that um, kind of turn the fortunes for people, and the people would be able to earn better because of it. Um, and so that's really when we started thinking. And of course, like, I was like a very typical like American Georgia Tech student, and like my first like ideas were not like this. Like, it was very like, oh, let's make an app, let's use all these like sensors and like save every drop of water, and they were very techy. Um, but a lot of that stuff was just extremely, extremely unaffordable for farmers. So I guess the bigger question was not to make like a water conservation solution alone, but was to make something which is a water conservation solution that could be used by the masses. And our solution is still too expensive for marginal farmers. It's still more of a middle and large farmer solution. But at least we're able to hit that middle and, like, 2 to 3 acre farmers that a lot of the other solutions that were there beforehand weren't able to hit. Um, so essentially, kind of to wind back, what we came up with was like a really simple solution, was to dig a really large pit in the ground, and to cover it up with a polymer lining that would prevent the percolation of water. So the idea was to capture any surplus water that was coming out. So surplus river water when the river overflowed, or surplus canal water when the canals were letting it out, like when they were opening the canals or whatever scheduled time, or rainwater, basically harvesting rainwater. So all of these different ways. So this would be surface water that would either just, it would flow and it would go into the seas. And the idea was to capture that. And so it was doing 2 things. One was that it was giving them this source of water that they could use throughout the year. But then secondly, it was also reducing their reliance on groundwater. And so because of that, like, the amount of times that they would have to dig a well and like start pumping water out and stuff into the ground, which is also very environmentally damaging, was also drastically reducing. So this is kind of the broad idea and just a little bit about it, but happy to go back and forth.
This is a super helpful sort of basis for the next few questions. So you came back from Georgia Tech. You had, this idea and this moment of realization that water is so important, and And all of us remember writing our Hindi essays in 6th, 7th standard saying Jal Jeevan hai, which it really is in this case. And what was it like for you to come back and then go into, rural parts of the country, which, correct me, my assumption is correct, but you may not have been as exposed to it as regularly as you are maybe right now. What was it like going back to that environment, and just the dynamic of dealing with a different demographic that you may not have interacted with? How
And
open were they to change, for example?
yeah, like just to add on to that, I feel like the connection between mental health and the water crisis is not an intuitive one that we can just make. And the thing is, what is sort of like an essay topic for us tends to be the very drastic reality of so many farmers in rural India. So yeah, just like adding on to Abhishek's question, there's this sort of massive gap when it comes to how the urban landscape deals with water conservation, and then how farmers or just rural India deals with water conservation. So could you like tell us a little bit more about that gap and how you've been working in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do Abhishek's question and then I'll come to this really
Yeah.
quickly. So with Abhishek's question, in terms of how was it to kind of go into a landscape that I was not familiar with, I think it was really difficult, honestly, because even the language, like I speak Marathi, my family is Maharashtrian, but the dialect is really different. And my grandmom would argue that I anyway barely speak Marathi. Like Marathi is very broken anyway. So that like in itself was such a struggle. But also in addition, like kind of going into rural India when you are a young, like a girl who they're not really used to seeing, in a decision making role, it is weird. Like, in rural India, one big like kind of marketing and awareness technique that people use is doing these exhibitions. There are like farmer exhibitions that are massive, and a lot of farmers come to them. So last December, Kisan is like the biggest farmer exhibition in the country. It happens in Pune every year, and there's about like 6 lakh visitors that come to it. So it really is like it's huge. And our company had like a really big stall and everything this year. And I remember like a farmer came to it and gave him the whole pitch, like, the spiel, like with all my best like marketing words. And I think my Marathi vocabulary is also on point with my product specifically, at least. But at the end of it, like he just gave me this very like bemused smile and he was like, "Acha, theek hai, par abhi papa ko bula ke lete aao." And it was like, it was like very like encompassing of my whole experience, because I think that I've in some senses struggled for people to take me seriously. So that's definitely been hard. But I think the trick has been to be persistent and to keep coming back to communities, right? So I feel like when you're persistent and when you keep going back, or now we have like a pretty large sales staff as well. So when our staff keeps going back to a particular community, they know that this company is serious about like water conservation. They're not somebody that's just going to come and go away the minute we've bought their product. And we try really hard to do that. Like, we have, for like a company of our size, we have a pretty large, we have like a 7-person customer relationship management team. And they, speak to all of our farmers every 3 months, checking in as to, like, how have the crops changed? Like, what were you taking before? What are you taking now? How has your income changed? All that kind of stuff. Yeah, so
Yeah.
so I was just saying that like for a company of our size, we have a pretty large CRM team and we have like 7 people on it. And so we call all of our farmers, and now we have 11,000 farmers. So the number is also like
It's amazing.
pretty large,
Yeah.
So we call all of our farmers every 3 months, checking in on, like what crops are you taking? Has your income actually increased? Like, is the product working fine? Like, kind of making sure that it's not just that we sold them something, but that they actually became richer because of it, and they were able to take more crops and they're living better lives because of it. So the point is not just to like sell them something and be done with it. Like I didn't want to create a company or a culture like that. So I think that has made people trust us more. But it's definitely a mix of that and kind of more traditional private sector marketing in some senses, right? And like advertisers, newspaper ads. We also make a really big deal out of like customer testimonials, and we have this program called Avana Ambassadors. So we have basically Avana Mitra and Avana Mahamitras, and they are like our farmer ambassadors. And so these are people who've bought a pond from us, and they've, like been really like helped by it, and they're ready to support us. And a lot of these people help us take like meetings in villages, and they do it completely voluntarily. So that's really like nice. Like we don't have, they're not like no payroll, no commission, nothing like that. But it's just like they do it as a service because they want more people to get involved with water conservation. So that's something that's been really rewarding, because when a farmer hears it from a different farmer, they like, it's kind of like us, right? Like if I want to buy like jeans, I want to hear it from my friend, not from like Levi's. Like I'm not going to.
It's a way for you to establish trust in a community that you're new in. Like you get local volunteers to sort of vouch on your behalf. I think that's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's kind of taking like the whole influencer model in a sense, to rural India.
Yes.
I'm taking notes from this for like our stuff to be here. So yeah, like this is I mean, but it's so interesting because people sort of tend to see social causes and social activism and business as two things that are very antithetical to each other. But you've done a very great job at like combining both of them, like an 11,000 farmer like outreach. That's amazing to hear. So could you tell us a little bit more about like how do you really marry a profitable business model with championing like a social cause?
Yeah, absolutely. I think business has really been misconceived, and I think it's definitely been because we've seen a lot of businesses that have only cared about their own profits.
Correct.
And so we have like giants like Walmart, where people will say if you become a Walmart supplier, that means you won't exist in a few years because they'll squeeze you out of your margins so hard. And so that's kind of this idea that's fed to us, that in order to become a big business, you have to squeeze someone. Like, it's like the faida or the profit is like this very restrictive commodity, and you have to snatch it from someone else to get it for yourself. And I just think that's so ridiculous. So I think it's amazing that this social enterprises as a movement have become so strong, and there are definitely people who've championed for it on a large level, like Patagonia or Tom's Shoes. There are companies who've really, or Ben and Jerry's even, who've actively given up. Like Ben and Jerry's, I know, and Abhishek's in the US, I feel like they are so open about the fact that they support left-wing politics, or what is considered left-wing politics in the US. That they give up a lot of customers because of it. And to me, that's what's being very true to your cause. But when it comes to a question of marrying it, I think it's been because I don't believe in either model entirely. So I think I explained pretty clearly why I don't believe in the private sector model, because I don't think that companies can exist for the sole benefit of the promoter, And I think it's also because I come from a certain sense of privilege where I've never felt like my entire livelihood is dependent on my work, which a lot of entrepreneurs, face in their early days, which also makes you motivated to work only for profits, which is fine. Yeah. But I think with that privilege working on my side, and to kind of make sure that caveat is heard, because I feel like a lot of people don't have the option to kind of take this leap of faith. But I think on the other side, the non-profit model really didn't appeal to me, because I volunteered with a lot of larger non-profits, and without naming anyone, I often felt like because the product was given for free, there was a quality compromise that happened. Because it's like, you're giving something to a community for free, they're not going to be able to grumble, right? But today, when a farmer makes like an Avana Jal Sanchay pond, he's giving me 2 lakh rupees. So if it's not like really good quality, he's gonna be mad, and that's okay. Like, he's a customer, right? Like, it's well within his right to be angry and to demand great quality. And I think that also, just some models from the private sector, like, with regard to marketing, with regard to outreach, I feel like when you are able to sell something, like, I'm not dependent in some senses on a donor funding me, or on convincing, like, a rich CEO or a government that water conservation is a topic that they should take up. Because I think here the power is in the hand of the community. And they know that water conservation is important, which is why I feel like the product has become such a hit so quickly. Because when I pitched this at competitions at Georgia Tech, often I got told that, like, this isn't going to work. There's no technology in this. But, like, that's just bullshit, right? Because, like, technology isn't just putting an app on a smartphone. It's about making, like, something simpler and easier to do. And I think that when you take that to a community and they see use in it, they'll pay you for it. So that's why I feel like, social enterprises are a really good model, because they allow you to kind of address a social cause while still making sure that you're giving a high quality, good product into a community.
That's so wonderful to hear. I mean, I feel like this is something that needs to be sort of drilled into the heads of all of us, because I mean, what you talked about, like how a lot of privilege also comes into entrepreneurship. I think that's very important, and entrepreneurship in particular is something we will get to very soon. But just about water conservation in general, like Abhishek said earlier, we know we're in a crisis. Like, we know we're running out of water. We know droughts are happening, and now more than before, we've seen how farmers have had to like bear the brunt of it. Like, we see all the farmer protests that are happening in India right now. But at the same time, we don't really feel like we're in a crisis. Like, if I were to open a tap, I would get water. And obviously, that's because of my privilege, but it's also like a conversation that it's easy to distance ourselves from, if that makes sense. And like, why do you think that is? Or like, why do you think the general conversation surrounding water conservation and water scarcity is sort of not as comprehensive as it should be? Like, what do you think plays into that?
I think that there's two major factors that I hear at play. I think one is definitely our privilege, right? I mean, I would say that India is in an education crisis. I mean, I think that if you just look at, and this is not about like within these last 8 years, no, like there's nothing like political about this. But I think if you look at the 70-year history or whatever 80-year history of the country, we're in an education crisis. Because if you look at the quality of teaching in our government schools, it's abysmal. And so I think, why is it that none of us care about it? It's because we're so distanced from the problem. And what often happens is that policymakers, business people, basically whoever is in a decision-making role is being fed by privilege, right? Like 78%, I read the statistic, don't quote me on it, but 78% or something like that in the world is like familial wealth, which is passed down. So privilege actually plays a much bigger role in decision-making than we give it credit for. And I think because of that, a lot of times policymakers and decision makers are very, very distanced from real social problems, which kind of, there's this huge gap, right? But I think with water conservation, there's also a second caveat which works into this, is that there's a lot of misdirected activism around water conservation. Like, I just want to bring light to the initial statistic that Abhishek quoted, which is really important, that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the groundwater usage of the country is rural. So only between 20 and 30% of the usage is actually urban. So when we think about, like, when urban youth think about the issue of water conservation, I've seen so many campaigns and so much money which is spent about shut the tap when you're brushing, or take a bath with one bucket of water, drink half a glass of water. But if you think about it on a policy level,
Right.
that's only affecting 20% of your usage, no? So if you think about like the Pareto principle, very simply, this is the 20% we need to discard. The rural is the 80% we really need to sit down and think about.
Yeah.
So I think that's also because of that misdirected activism, and I think that happens a little bit in a lot of social spheres, that things become campaigns really quickly, but people don't really sit down and assess, okay, like what is the impact of this campaign and how is that going to affect kind of the whole social issue that I'm working towards.
So I think that you made a great point, which I want to sort of probe for. Are you still here? Oh yeah. You made a great point, which I want to sort of delve further into, which is this idea of a divide between people who are making decisions that are largely based in urban settings and then people in rural parts of the country. And this is not to discredit local governance. I think we have a really good panchayat and local governance system, which is decentralized and does a lot of great things. But at the end of the day, water conservation requires national coordination, and that coordination happens in, say, state capitals, and obviously in New Delhi, which is the capital. The other disconnect is like society, like you, me, and the media, particularly the media being so heavily urban focused and sort of so concerned with the the trivialities of urban upper middle class and elite lifestyles, do not cover the issues that are relevant to a large part of the population. Is that also your sort of view on what's going on? And do you think that a lack of media and popular sort of social discourse on this issue, is it anemic in your view? And are we really doing anything about that?
Absolutely. And I feel like with the original point of whether, the decision makers are urban for a very, very largely rural population, it's not just even that they're urban, but it's also that they're urban, upper class, kind of elite people for a large population that's not very similar to that demographic, right? And so, again, like to her original point, that we are very distanced from these issues because of that. And I actually posted something on my Instagram story a few days ago for which I got so much like angry messaging from a lot of people. But I said something to the effect of, when one Bollywood celebrity completes suicide, there is so much media discourse around it. But there are thousands of farmers who are dying in this country, and there's absolutely no media discourse. Like the media
you just said the quiet part out loud. I mean, that's what everyone is thinking, and nobody has the guts to say. So I mean, and you post a thing on social media, and people will get upset at you. So that's put that aside.
Yeah, and like like it's just like Arnab Goswami isn't like coming and yelling about it, and I think it's and it maybe it's not even just him, it's not just Republic, but it's all of the TV channels, it's all of media that isn't addressing these kind of larger issues that I really think need to be addressed. And I think it's like a matter of kind of what sells, right? In some senses, because all of these are profit making companies. So it's like how many urban people will click maybe on an article about farmer suicide versus how many are going to click on like gossip, let's say, surrounding a Bollywood celebrity's death.
Right.
And so I think as consumers of media, we also need to be more like we need to think a little bit more about what we're clicking on and what we're consuming in terms of content. Because I keep telling my friends this. I'm like, if you're gonna bitch about like Seema Auntie, but then you're gonna go watch it, then Netflix is making money off of it, So if you're not mindful of the content that you consume, then I mean, I think it doesn't make sense. But yeah,
I think we have a tendency to underscore the influence the media has on how we deal with very charging issues. Because it's not cool to talk about farmers. It's not cool to talk about rural India and their issues. But it's cool if I talk about everything else that's that we see happening. But yeah, I think that's definitely a point we should also like really settle on. It's that it's easy to distance ourselves from these issues, but at the end of the day, the reason we have food on our tables, the reason our economy functions the way it does, is because of what is going on in rural India, what these farmers are doing. Because when we say that they're the backbone of, like the agricultural sector is the backbone of India, it's not like a inspirational rhetoric. It's a very valid fact. It matters, and it needs to matter, and our priorities sort of need to be aligned in that sphere.
Yeah, and I also think with regard to the point that you're making about like what's cool to talk about, I think that goes into not just content but also into solutions, right? Where like a lot of times it's like when you're thinking of a potential career or a potential problem that you want to solve, I always ask this question: why is AI so much cooler than agricultural water conservation? Like, why don't I get this street cred, but like, jokes apart, like, I think that it's because, like, these like technological issues have such a cool tag attached to them today. So many more smarter people want to go and solve those problems. So I think like also with younger people, we really need to think about what we're thinking about, like cool careers or like what's sexy or what's good to do after college, And I think that a lot of these issues do deserve our attention. And of course, like you said, like it's because these people are the backbone of our economy and they're putting food on our table. But that's also a little bit like, respect a woman because wo kisi ki maa hai and because kisi ki behan hai. But, she's also a woman. So in the same way, they're also, 70% of the country. Forget that they're putting food on our table. Forget that they're the backbone of the economy and they're affecting us in any which way. I think we do need like more than, I don't know how many percent of like young urban youth think about working in the rural sector, but I think we need more, basically.
That's very true. I think their intrinsic value in of themselves needs to matter to us because, there's like you said, they're such a big part of our population, and if you're supposed to be this diverse country that takes into account every social profile's needs, farmers need to be one of those people. I think that's very true, and this is also a very good segue into our conclusion, which is like, do you have any general advice for young people who might be considering their career choices or choosing what major they want, like any along those lines? Because you've worked so actively in this field, is there anything you'd like to say to them?
I think just be willing to get your hands dirty and to try out different things. I think there are a lot of organizations, companies as well as, non-profits or social enterprise or whatever that work in rural India. So if that's something that you are interested in, I know a lot of companies that would want to onboard people, who've worked in other careers or who have different kinds of majors and stuff. So for example, even with us, we have like a no educational requirement policy because we want, as diverse as possible of and kind of an employee group to join us. And so literally we have projects where somebody who's only been to school till the 8th grade is working with somebody who's done their masters from IIT. And of course, there's so much educational diversity, but I think that's what brings kind of the power to the thinking system that our company has, right? Is because there's people who are coming in from truly diverse backgrounds. Like it's not just token diversity. So I think that there are companies trying to create that. And so if you do research and if you try to reach out to these organizations, because I've had a lot of people reach out to me just on LinkedIn or Instagram and even just ask advice about like, hey, I'm interested in like this particular aspect of like, let's say rural India. And I'm always happy to like patch them up with other entrepreneurs if our company doesn't do anything, in that space to patch them up with someone else. But also, I think, to think on the entrepreneurial side is also always interesting. So if you're not looking to work for someone, I think even if you did an internship or something in a rural company for a summer, you would see a ton of different business opportunities. Like, I think the business potential is so large, it's really waiting to be explored. So if people are considering entrepreneurship, then I would, like urge them to think outside of just urban India. Of course, urban India is a huge market, but I think this is a huge market as well. So to think outside of just kind of this like limited sphere that we think of.
I think this was genuinely wonderful, and I don't know, I may be biased. This was like my favorite episode. We've done so
Thank you.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun. I think
Thank you.
you
I had
a
a
lot of
great
good
time.
advice.
I love talking about all of this, and I guess our takeaway is actually go vocal for local in its truest sense. So I wish I could like describe how much I enjoyed this. This was genuinely so wonderful. Both of us, I think I learned so much, and I'm sure Abhishek did as well, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. So before we wrap up, just let us know if anyone wants to reach you or reach Avana, like where they can go to.
Sure. So our website is www.avana.co.in. So you can check out our work out there. We also are on Instagram at Avana Agriculture. And my Instagram handle would probably be tagged, right? When Great. Okay. So you can also reach out to me personally if you want to chat about anything related to water conservation or agribusiness. I'm always very happy to talk about those topics. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I had a great time talking to you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
This
was awesome.
Yeah, and I'm sure like maybe a few I don't know, like in the future, I'm sure where Avana has like reached much greater heights. We'd love to hear an update on your work and how. And hopefully that's a time when the conversation surrounding water scarcity is more active and more informed. So yeah, thank you so much for doing this. It was lovely to have you, and take care. We hope you stay safe, and yeah, just have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.
You too.
So that was our conversation with the wonderful Maithili Appalwar from Avana. All relevant links are in our description below. So if you want to reach out to her or if you want to reach out to Avana, that's how you can do that. Once again, Maithili, thank you so much for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode. We have got some super exciting stuff coming up. So we can't wait to see you again.